Good evening, everybody. My name is Orla Feely. I'm Vice President of University College Dublin for Research, Innovation and Impact. And it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the launch of this wonderful volume, Joyce Remembered, the 2022 edition by Constantine Curran, with essays by Hugh Campbell, Diarmuid Ferriter, Anne Fogarty, Margaret Kelleher, Helen Salterer, and also the UCD Special Collections presented by Eugene Roche and Evelyn Flanagan. First of all, it's a joy to be back in Molly. How many times during lockdown was I commenting to colleagues, wouldn't it be wonderful when we were in Molly again on a sunny evening enjoying a glass of wine in the garden? So it's wonderful, and given the awful circumstances we've been through over the past couple of years, we don't take these things for granted anymore. So it really is a great pleasure to be here, and of course hugely fitting to be here. This is the building where we house #1 copy of Ulysses. It's the building where Constantine Curran met James Joyce. The first page of his book talks about entering this building under the leaded lion from Van Nost, the entrance that we all used this evening. So it's very, very fitting that we are here this evening to celebrate this launch. It's of course also fitting, this is a collaboration, this wonderful museum between... Just wait a moment. It's a wonderful collaboration between University College Dublin and the National Library of Ireland. And Margaret, I was delighted in your piece to read about the National Library and its significance for Padraic Colum. You mentioned that it was its free pastures, as described by Curran, that were Colum's educational landscape, if you like, because he couldn't afford to come to UCD. So it's wonderful to think of that relationship between our institutions and the different educational journeys of individuals going back so far. This book, of course, speaks to us in UCD, our history, as I've just described, as well as our present. And in terms of our present, first of all, we have the wonderful UCD Special Collections, from which so much of this book is derived. Again, that wonderful essay by Eugene Roche and Evelyn Flanagan, describing the Helen Laird collection in UCD Special Collections, of which we are so proud. And the wonderful photographic collection is presented so beautifully in the pages of the book here. And as ever, I want to thank Noel Moran and Conor Graham of UCD Press for doing a characteristically beautiful job of the presentation of this book that really befits the wonderful content. We also have essays from a number of our leading scholars in UCD, and something that gives me particular pleasure is to see how it involves scholars from across various disciplines of the university, working together so constructively and so harmoniously through the periods of lockdown and producing a work that speaks to all of us. And also Helen Salterer. Wonderful to have Helen Salterer part of this work. Helen, of course, although she's not a UCD scholar, she is, of course, family, and literally family, in the context of this book. So it's absolutely wonderful to have Helen here with us this evening. And in reading through the book, which I hadn't personally encountered before, I was very struck by, first of all, how conversational and accessible and authentic it is. Padraic Colum described it as like a good talk in a Dublin dining room. And you really get a sense of those contemporaries of Joyce. I think, Anne, you described their intellectual ambition at the time. This wonderful cast of characters that are brought to life in these pages. Again, another quote that Margaret uses talks about their meetings in the theatres and tea rooms and pubs of Dublin, and you really get a sense of that town and generation, as in the title of Margaret's essay. And then Hugh Campbell takes that image of the town and the position in which these people lived, and how there are such linkages between the two, both of them so beautifully described within these pages, and the dense web of associations, again another term in the book, between the place and the people. So I think that is conveyed so wonderfully within the book. Diarmuid Ferriter then brings us to the political context in which all this was happening, and then Helen brings us to the deeply personal and to her family connection with her grandfather. And then Anne Fogarty, in the final essay before the Special Collections piece, situates this in the context of Joycean studies, in the context of other biographical studies of the period. And Anne finished up with a quote she gave a variant on a quote from Richard Ellman, which talked about how we are still learning to be contemporaries of Joyce. A quote that I loved. And for us in UCD, we are so proud to be the University of James Joyce. And I suppose thinking about it, we are still learning what it means to be the University of James Joyce. And a wonderful study such as this that draws on so much of what we have in University College Dublin, our special collections, our scholarship, our UCD Press, I think it takes us a further step on that journey. So I'm delighted that UCD was able to support this wonderful publication. I hope that you all very much enjoy the discussion and the chat over the course of the evening. So thank you all for coming. And I'll pass over now to Frank McNally, who's going to chair our discussion.
Okay, I think Helen wants to say a few words first, maybe just to thank people in the room to chat.
Wow! Serendipity. It's magnificent to see all of you here. So many different friends of so many different circles, including unknown friends. I'm extraordinarily moved. And I think we're going to have a whale of a time discovering and discussing and sorting out this crazy collective book, which I have to tell you how it happened. COVID, as Orla already mentioned, thank you, Orla. COVID at the worst moments when we were Zooming away, and at a certain point, myself stuck in Durham, North Carolina, everybody else here in Ireland, I said, I can look at them straight in the mouth at least and know that we're going to make this book. Amazing how we envisaged it together. And really the first aim was to widen the frame for the memories that my grandfather, CP or Con Curran, people named him many different things, finally got together in his later years to publish. But he'd been at it for a long time. For us, we listened in. He had actually remarked to Joyce in a 1917 letter, sort of prodding him, wouldn't you think about individualizing a little bit more a few of the characters in the group? So in some ways, that's what we played and attempted with. But we did it today, and we were working very much in the spirit of that cohort, many other circuits that all of the colleagues from UCD knew far better than I did. And the questions were, who else would come into the picture more clearly in a new way today? What particular Dublin would also come into better focus? And how would it look to us today? We went back to the books, the photos, the drawings, the scads of stuff that are ably overseen by Evelyn and Eugene lurking somewhere up there in special collections. What were once in various stories in Garville Avenue and Rathgar. And that really inspired us to think how Curran's writing on Joyce came into a fuller sense when put in the context of much more of his writing, and specifically how he always thought in terms of the artists and the artisans that he was intent on cultivating. And I have to say, the Jack Yates book plate done in the early 40s gives you that sort of aha moment where you see this maze of objects in which the Cesare Ripa, the iconologist of the 17th century, looking back, trying to make sense of it, but of course don't forget down in the bottom is the painter who's actually looking out the window to see what's to come next with the new generation. Then there was all the accumulated talk over many years that many people I know in this room heard as well and took in their own ways, that made it clear that we had to pursue the questions that we were asking in terms of the double centenary, not only that of Joyce's fiction, but just as strongly that of the founding of the Irish Free State, and yes, the outbreak of civil war. What could more of Curran's writing and the particular circumstances of it with his wider cohort bring to light today that for many reasons we couldn't see earlier? And then there were the letters. as people in this room know better than I do. Ailish McDougall supported so many people. In my instance, she passed a series of hilarious scribbled notes of hers with my mother, Elizabeth Curran Salter. And that confirmed how absolutely crucial it was to think of a wider picture, and that included their generation at UCD and elsewhere, as well as a fuller picture in Paris. And so to embark on that investigation with this amazing group of colleagues with whom we just met on Zoom, frankly created a happy dilemma for me between curiosity about family history and my gut reactions as a professional historian, between affection for my grandparents and my critical reflexes. But of course, exactly in that kind of jam, that's where you turn to your real people, the unknown people, and the collaboration that resulted with all of the people here and many others in the room. So I do have to say a few thanks, sort of inflecting what Orla has already thanked, because of what is extraordinary about this collaboration. Is Declan hiding out there somewhere? Declan Kybert. Fellow traveler and supporter from a long time, he actually made it to the empire of Blue Devils, that is my University Duke in Durham, North Carolina. By the way, he wasn't the only one. I think Luke Gibbons did as well. Declan, who brought his puckish sense of language and his understanding of Joyce's Dublin. And thank God he educated those known affectionately as theory heads in my university. Thank you, Declan. Margaret, inimitable impresario, whose gift and experience connecting people contributed fundamentally to this book. Hugh, your eye, not only as an architect, but also as a writer, who brought us to Curran's photography, and equally importantly, who brought the Plattenbau studio team of Jennifer O'Donnell and Jonathan Janssens on board with their extraordinary, inventive, and exacting drawing. Diarmid, where's Diarmid hiding out? Diarmid Ferreter, who made time at the crescendo moment of the decade of centenaries to come on board, and as Orla has said, to address the political history involved. And Anne, our Joycean, who reminded me, we're not sure if we actually crossed paths in UCC in the last century, but in fact, realizing that Joyce was barely taught at that point in the distant mist of the 20th century. And Evelyn and Eugene, who have been such extraordinary stewards of special collections, not just the Helen Laird collection, but of the incredible riches that UCD Special Collections has. And Alice Ryan, again, she should be sitting among us. Alice Ryan, who co-edited this for us and ran many trips in COVID, running the gauntlet to get into the archives, as well as to do a line by line of Curran's text as only a Joycean could do. And of course, it would be impossible that we're all here today if it weren't for Noel, Moran, and Connor, Graham, and all the UCD Press team, who, not just on the screen, but in the warehouse, downstairs, made this book possible. And Daniel Moorhead, who designed this incredibly beautiful book. It's good to meet you at last in person, however you're dressed, and for your visual sense, to highlight not only Curran's visual way of thinking, but to give a place, a pride of place in some ways, to the original drawing of the Plattenbau studio. And Simon, wherever Simon is, thank you for welcoming us back, to Mali. Frank, get us going now, please.
Okay, I'm going to begin with an advance apology. This is the one of the most wide-ranging subjects and definitely the widest-ranging panel I've ever been asked to chair. So I expect to get very confused very quickly. I'm acutely aware there are people in the audience who know a lot more about the individual aspects of this multi-layered man than I do. So I was going to say we would open it to questions at the end, but actually, if anybody wants to interrupt at any point with a question for any of the panelists, please feel free, just raise your hand. I'm going to start with you, Helen. I know you've just spoken, but you've got the most personal connection with this this very unusual man. He wasn't CP or concurrent to you, he was Dado. Explain to me where and when you first met him.
So I gather in a Beckett sort of way, he probably met me when I was in utero, since my mother came back very intently every year to visit her father in Rathgar. But I was lucky enough to know him every summer until I was 13. And as you said, I'm sure, and it'll be interesting what other people in the room who knew him in as many guises would add to that. Okay,
and this is Garville Avenue, Rathgar, which we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
My sister used to live in a house just up the road, so I know exactly where it is. Among other things, among his many distinctions, obviously he went to school with Joyce, or college with Joyce. He has been proposed as the model for Gabriel Conroy.
You know, I'm not sure he's actually convinced by that.
I'm going to ask Anne about this as well.
So maybe Anne would riff on it first.
Perhaps in my ignorance, this is Gabriel Conroy from the famous short story, The Dead. And I've always thought that was actually Joyce himself. It was, a sort of slightly bad-tempered journalist stroke writer.
Yes, Curran I think not so much, but of course all of Joyce's characters are composites, so you can never rule somebody out completely. So, they're different characters real-life characters come together in Gabriel Conroy, I would say.
Okay, I thought that Elman had suggested somewhere specifically that he might have been part of the model for Conroy, but...
he slipped...
doesn't quite fit. I mean, the definite aspects which are, could create better or right.
Sure. He was also, from a more practical point of view, he was a contributor, as were a great many people, to Joyce's work. Joyce was a great man for delegating for drawing on his various research resources and for getting people to look up stuff for him, especially when he was so far removed from the city that he was writing about. Tell me a little bit about that. Was it specifically he was tapped into for things like Deneen's dictionary or for Tom's directory details about Dublin?
There's, I'm sure, a long laundry list of Dubliners who could be added, who were hit up for exactly that kind of assignment. My mother, with her quip of a tongue, said, here come the Stooges, because Joyce, of course, was notorious for turning to so many people for doing exactly that. But in Dado's case, I would say he was not taken in by it, but at the same time enjoyed the heel of the hunt. That is because he was such a lover of Dublin, as other people here know better than I do, that he was happy to go checking things out in whatever directory or whatever book to hand.
And even when they weren't meeting, they would have written to each other extensively over the years. Most of this was done by, I presume, by written correspondence.
After, obviously, he left for Pola and then Trieste, and as Evelyn and Eugene and many others here who know the correspondence inside out, we now have, thanks to Evelyn and Eugene and UCD, a nucleus of the early correspondence in UCD's library, where, yes, they were tracking that kind of detail. But those letters also are ad copy of Joyce. He was a brilliant publicist from early on, so reporting on what the latest completion date, TBA, will it make it by 1718, and of course, he was off by a couple of years. Those letters are, I think, as interesting for that reason, giving a sense of the timeline of the completion of Dubliners and Ulysses.
Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself anyway, because first of all, we should probably talk about, since considering where we are, we should talk about his first meeting with Joyce, and there's that famous moment where he describes him, I'm not quoting exactly, but he hears Joyce called upon by one of the teachers, his name I've forgotten, and he turns around and sets eyes on his first poet. To remind us a little bit about that moment and the context.
You may have heard this more often than I did, but I remember a number of years ago, by chance I happened to be here. I'm not sure it was Bloomsday particularly, but it was in that zone. And I turn on RTA1, the radio, and it was my grandfather's voice saying exactly this. It was eerie. It was eerie. In other words, it was a memory he rehearsed many times. And so, you know, we have to play with that. We have to take that into account. I think it was a constructed moment that had a real live charge to it. It was an aesthetic charge that he cherished.
It was to
but
use...
did it happen exactly that way? Kise. But it's a great story, and he told it many times.
To use a word that comes up again and again with Joyce, it seems to have been an epiphany, or at least he was granted it as an epiphany, that he was in the presence of greatness. People will know more about this incident that I've read about and forgotten some of the details of, but he was being asked, the lecturer was asking about a particular poet. He asked the audience, had they read a certain poet? And he said, Mr. Joyce. Joyce obviously had a reputation already, and of course Joyce had read about it. And this is when Colin Curran looks around and sets eyes on the poet fully formed. Maybe, Anne, you know more about this, that particular moment than I do.
No, not really, but I agree with what Helen said. I mean, these are memories, but this is a very self-conscious generation, and they're aware that they belong. Colum Curran, all of the other UCD friends, that they belong to a cohort. They really have a sense of themselves as a generation, and of course increasingly so as hindsight grew. And therefore we have books like this. And the fact that Joyce had become a celebrity puts pressure on them to document all the more and to give us a kind of portrait of Joyce in Dublin. It's not Joyce's Dublin per se that they talk about, but Joyce in Dublin, a Dublin that they share. And sometimes they're kind of laying down a marker, trying to correct the documentary view, the outside view of Joyce in Ireland as, you know, mediated by Elman and lots of other journalists and so on. But it's a hugely literary generation as well. They're just, print is their medium, and they voluminously correspond with each other. There isn't a voluminous correspondence, I would say, between Curran and Joyce. It's intermittent. Joyce's letters are often quite transactional, as letters were in the period, the way we send emails. But what's remarkable is that it's a continuous friendship. It's a lifelong friendship that Colum Curran, C.P. Curran upholds to the very end. And they're not thinking about Joyce the celebrity. They know he's become a celebrity. In the meantime, he's become the leading figure in modernism. But they still cleave to their young man they knew. Giving back answers in lectures in UCD, you know, that's the link that they have, and that's what gives a charge to things.
But the impression, and that story relates to it, the impression of the young man they knew, they imply that his greatness was obvious already, even at the age of 18 or 20, that this was a man destined. And that is the impression that Joyce gives himself, if we believe Stephen Dedalus was him in Ulysses, because he's 22 in that, and there's that interminable chapter in the National Library where he's explaining his ingenious theories about Hamlet, and all these wise old heads are hanging on his every word. It's like Jesus in the temple, and that was Joyce's impression of himself. But that seems to be backed up at least by Curran and others who've written about him.
Yes, they shared his interest in languages and literature as well. They shared his ambition and drive, I think. But he was already predestined to become what he becomes later. They knew that. I mean, so did the wider literary circles beyond Lady Gregory, Yeats, Joyce, Julie, befriends all of them and insults them. But makes it clear that he's destined to become this writer in the future. And in a way, they're all invested in him.
We'll bring Margaret in.
Sure. Yeah, no, I was just struck there, Frank, that what we're discussing, can everyone hear me okay, is crucial to, I think, both the aim and the achievement of this book. And again, I want to echo Orla's words in saluting Helen's role in this regard, because it's been very striking, as Orla was speaking, to think of so many of us who work in UCD have never actually worked together in this way before. So that itself is such a joy to be part of. But I think one of the things that's very clear reading Curran about Joyce, and it's why I was interested in the Padraic Colum connection as well, is that just to echo really what Anne is saying, this is about connections and networks by people who are remembering their friendships from a very early age. And I think what's really important about this book is it is both about the great man and the networks and connections. It's not actually one or other. And sometimes when one wants to, what would you say, reject or subvert or undermine the great man model of literary history, and we all spend a lot of time doing that, it can sometimes maybe be at the expense of the greatness. What's wonderful about this is they are all saluting the greatness, but they're also showing that Joyce didn't live in isolation. Right. He lived in connection, he lived in solidarity, he lived in loyalty, he lived in emotions. And it is, I think, a great achievement of this book that it's both and. It's both the great man and the networks and connections around him.
It must be you then made the point in the book, I'm sorry, I don't have the reference, but you were comparing it, somebody was comparing it to his approach, his description of that generation, to Roy Foster's book about the revolutionary generation.
Yes.
The faces, which I read, and it was fascinating. I mean, the whole idea was you were reading about people that you never heard of in relation, in some cases, never heard of in relation to the 1916 Rising, but they were part of the sort of ferment of ideas that
yes.
fed into it. Everything from, you know, obviously feminists, but vegetarians, anti-vivisectionists, animal rights act, people you think didn't necessarily exist in Ireland
yes.
of 1910, yeah. 14, 16.
And let me not go any further without adding, you know, a couple of really important women's names into the mix there. Obviously, there's Helen Laird, Helen's grandmother, and one of the things I discovered along the way is that as well as Padraic Colum and Curran having a lifelong friendship, Padraic Colum and Helen Laird were friends from a very young age. So there's a wonderful letter, you know, which we have thanks to Helen, where basically Helen Laird is down the country at home in Limerick, and Padraic Colum is sending her what we would call in Cork the ska from Dublin. And then similarly, the importance of Mary Maguire Colum, who's somebody I'm researching at the moment, who's a really important part of this story. So as Anne says, they're really important figures themselves later who are remembering from a particular vantage point.
Okay. Hugh, tell me a bit about the photography of Con Curran. He's famous for taking one particularly picture of a rakish young Joyce challenging looking straight back at the camera. It became one of the definitive images. He was a very
keen photographer, and his father was a photographer, or took photographs and had cameras and so on around the place. Actually, so there's a number of photographs in the collection. That one and the two versions of the graduation photograph from 1902, and then the 1904 portrait of Joyce. And then there was a number of the other photographs that I became interested in of Eccles Street and parts around Eccles Street that I think we thought were from the 1930s. I think they're actually more like the 1940s. So when Helen asked me to be involved, I think she probably had the reasonable expectation that I would be writing about Curran's writing about architecture, because Curran wrote a lot about architecture, and I knew quite a lot of that writing, including about this building, or 85, 86, Bank of Ireland, a number of other very, very good books and essays. But I became very interested in two things: the photographs, and then his descriptions of, particularly in his memoirs, that his childhood in the city and the way that himself and his peers inhabited the city, and then the way that he was remembering that. So this photograph then in particular, that was taken by Curran in his back garden, became the sort of point of departure for me, or a sort of fixation, I guess.
This is sorry, I forgot it's actually on the cover.
It's right there.
It's the this was when 1904. So the famous year,
between 2 and 3 in the
year of Ulysses.
Well, so the essay became about trying to, well, among other things, about trying to, let's say, recreate the event of that photograph, which is kind of glancingly referred to by Curran. You know, he talks about meeting Joyce on the Blackyear Bridge. Maybe that was the day I took the photograph. But by the time, but the envelope that the negative is contained, the glass negative is contained in the collection, he brings it to be developed in a pharmacy that only opens in 1909. So there's some time elapses between the taking of the photograph and the developing of the photograph. So much so, actually, that he then dates this photograph as circa 1904. He can't quite remember when it was. So I was kind of interested in trying to recreate and get back to that moment. Why was that photograph taken? When exactly was it taken? So that's when Johnny and Jenny came on board, because their practice is about using architectural drawing and map making to try to, let's say, investigate particular landscapes or places. So what they did was to produce a drawing that sets out the sort of larger context for the moment when Curran and Joyce are in his back garden.
Okay, I was going to come to that in a moment. Yes, sorry, it's the back garden in where somewhere.
It's on 6 Cumberland Terrace on the North Circular Road.
Right. Okay.
Just not quite up to Hanlon's Corner.
And was the photograph, to your knowledge, was it a spur of the moment thing, or was it something that they had composed in advance?
They were meeting a lot of the time because Curran was lending him money, and Joyce had moved over from St Peter's Terrace, where he had been living, over to Shelburne Road, right? A wide room, Shelburne Road, where he had a piano, anyway. So at that stage, he'd have to have a purpose, I think, to come and call on Curran. And it was also around the time he was reading the manuscript of Stephen Hero. He was given it. And also the setup of, like, it's a camera on a tripod, so it's not a snapshot. It's quite a deliberate portrait. So that was the way that increasingly it seemed to me. And Curran quotes Edmund Wilson saying in Axel's Castle, like, if we didn't have the photograph, Curran says, he refers specifically to this photograph, he doesn't really, but he says, if we didn't have photographs with Joyce, he wouldn't know what Stephen looked like. Right. Which is kind of an interesting thing about, you know, because there's no descriptions really in Joyce of physical things. So these photographs actually, I think, do play into your perception, particularly of Stephen, maybe of Leopold Bloom to an extent. So I was kind of interested in the and then this photograph circulates it, you know, from the 1920s. It's around a lot. It's in quite a lot of the university collections. He's apparently distributing copies of it in Paris in the post-publication of Ulysses. So
it became a very important part of the image, for want of a better word. Jennifer, tell me about the wonderful. I don't know whether to call it a map or a drawing. It's obviously a bit of both.
It's a bit of both, and it's a bit imagination, I think.
Is there any way we could pick up? There is a slide of it up there.
I think Johnny has to run, and
please,
Johnny can do technical stuff in the background. Okay. So Hugh got in touch with us last summer because he was interested in this photograph and particularly placing it in the context of the city at that time. And so we started with an idea about a very simple sketch that would be included within the book and go along with the essay. And that led in the end to this, which is a much larger drawing in the end, which talks about that photo in the context of the city itself. So part of it was almost a requirement to speculate as part of this, because we knew the details of the photo as they were, but everything else was slightly guesswork and was part detective work on our part. So together with Hugh, we went and visited the house in the summer, and we got into the back garden, and using a sun path diagram that Paul Kenny at UCD had done, we knew the direction that Joyce would have been facing. And then in the maps from the early 1900s, we found the position of the greenhouse, which is gone now. And so, and then with the camera...
Where exactly? Which is the garden?
It's a bit blurry,
If you look on that, it's not very high res, but you can see Joyce and Curran in there.
All right.
It's a kind of a...
Yeah.
You're almost blocking it, Frank.
You want to see that?
Buy the book.
I'm astonished at how much countryside there is in
So that's the kind of fascinating thing, that the Curran's house stood on the threshold between city and country at that point. Like North Circular Road was extremely new, to the point that they hadn't planted the trees yet. North Circular Road nowadays, everyone who knows it, is very leafy and green, and they weren't planted until after 1904. And so it was really on the frontier between the kind of, the landscape or the countryside of Ireland and then the territory of the city being built on top of it. And so the beginning of the drawing is all fact. We photographed the stones in the wall and redrew them, and every blade of grass and the tomato plants in the shed. Everything that was fact and that we know to be true from the photo is in it. And then we extrapolate out from there. And that is a mixture of all of the kind of historical research that we could gather, and then imagination on our part, kind of choosing things of value, like ornamental trees and the trams, the type of lamppost that would have been in it. I guess trying to play with Hugh's point that everything that was happening was happening in the context of the larger city at the time, that they weren't alone in the world, although they are purposefully the only two people we place in the drawing, but that it was happening in a larger context, an idea about life within the city itself.
Okay, very good. What is, just as a matter of interest, what is that on the...
So that's the church at Phibsborough, which we know they started building the spire in 1902 and they didn't finish...
St. Peter's Church.
St. Peter's Church, yeah. And they finished building it, we think, in 1911, because there's a photo in 1915 of it finished. So our artistic license is saying the spire was under construction, but it wasn't done at that stage. And behind it is Mountjoy Prison, and when you move towards the left, you get... the railway track out, heading out of Dublin, and the Cabra Road, and of course cows, because Hanlon's Corner would have been around the corner, and horses, because they would have used horses with the stables at the back for transport. So there's a kind of a decision as to what things do you bring into the drawing that somehow expand that story of that moment. So
this general area, this is a big part of what became Ulysses. I know Ulysses is the whole city, but I mean a lot of it starts. Is it Eccles Street in or around?
Eccles Street is just over the horizon.
Yeah, so
everybody needs a bigger book.
It's Joyceana Central kind of, as well as the fact.
What I think is interesting is the field, and like to think of him coming back. That was his stay in Paris in 1903, and then coming back, and this is his world again.
Yeah.
It's kind of, to me anyway, it's slightly just repositioned my sense of him and his experience of what a city was, in a way that even if you looked at maps for a long time, or a photograph, you wouldn't necessarily get.
Yeah. Eugene and Evelyn, tell me a little bit more about what exactly is in the collection.
Okay, so I guess what I would say is that the collection is really a reflection of Con Curran and Helen Laird, and their friendships and their networks. And I think that we wanted to try and get across through this book the way that the collection does reflect them as people and who they knew. And I think it's interesting what people have been saying, like about the correspondence, though you say it's not very voluminous, that it goes on for so many decades, and it kind of is a testimony to their friendship and the longevity of Joyce and Curran's friendship. But again, turning to what Margaret was saying about the great man and going beyond that to see what else, like it really shows, the collection really demonstrates, and I think you can see that through the book and the illustrations in the book, the breadth of their networks. And I will say as well that for a long time, like the collection was actually we called it the Con Curran collection. And it's only in the past few years, in speaking with Helen, that we really began to think about Helen Laird and Con Curran, and how the collection is really a reflection of both of them, and how important Helen was to their friendships and their relationships. So that is their friendships with the Joyces, also their friendships with the Colums, and also there's a lot of material within the collection relating to Helen Laird as an actress. And we have a very, very small selection of material from the collection in a display case over here today. And it includes an item that was sent to, or given to Con Curran and Helen Laird by Jack B. Yates in memory of his wife Cotty. So it has some drawings by Cotty to just show the depth of their friendship. So I think that is, I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think it's really important to think about their networks and the way that this is reflected in the collection. And I mean, the collection is the letters. It's also the book collection, the photograph collection that Hugh has been talking about, and also this vast collection of political ephemera that speaks very much to what Diarmuid wrote about, and which is actually a part of Con Curran's life that we didn't know very much about at all, and we're very glad to know more about, to have all of this material. Like the political ephemera includes wonderful collection of 1916 rising postcards, which actually have been digitized by the UCD Digital Library. So it really is vast and kind of like has a really wide breadth and shows their interests but also their friendships. Would you like anything to say?
If I could add one thing, Frank. Eugene, please.
No. I think there's very little to add to what Evelyn has said there. But yeah, I mean, some of the highlights are obviously the correspondence between Curran and Joyce, but there's so much more as well. Evelyn was talking about the 1916 postcards, which are rather strange if you think about it. You know, that they show Dublin after the Rising, a completely destroyed city, and they're in the form of a postcard that you could, send to your friends, and perhaps write on the back, "Wish you were here." But that is just, one small part of the connection. But we also have actually some 78 RPM records of Joyce reciting extracts from Ulysses. Now, we have never actually played those, but and there are other copies. Well, there's actually only 19 other copies of the ones that we have that were out in a limited collection, limited to 20. But I think Columbia University in the States actually had the temerity not only to play theirs, but they recorded it as well and put it up on the internet. So there's just a few kind of items that stick in my memory. Not the most important, but I suppose the most memorable to me.
Sure. Okay. Very good. Helen, you want to add something? You don't need this. You're mic'd up.
Yeah. One of the most surprising things in the discovery that I shared, and again, I'm sure that there are other people in the room that can comment on this knowingly, when finding both in the UCD archives and in the Curran collection in the Architectural Archive on Marion Square, the notes, the handwritten notes by Curran when Michael Collins authorized him to be the man to go in to assess the damage and the destruction of the Public Records Office and the forecourts. I was astounded to see that. And it was Diarmuid, obviously as our historian, who evaluated that and was struck by how it completely turned inside out. The stereotype of cautious con, the foodie, the over-pious fellow that could barely get off the dime. Excuse me for the US currency. And I realized that that must have been one of the deep triggers of why he began collecting. If he had seen that level of destruction that was not tantamount to the destruction of men and women and children, but was nonetheless a massive human destruction in historical terms, that moved him to collect. And as someone who adores libraries, and I'm trying to bring the 15 and the 20-year-olds back into the library after COVID, it sticks.
I have a parochial question. I was delighted to discover, we were talking about this briefly beforehand, I was delighted as always to discover there's a Monaghan connection to this story. High as we are on the heroic events at Clonus yesterday when we relegated Dublin to the darkness of Division 2. There's a Clonus connection via the McGahan, the maternal, the current C.P. Curran's mother's family, and a remarkable angle involving Bulgaria. Tell me about that again, because I was hearing the story when we got interrupted.
And I believe Dermot Ferreter was also really intrigued by the story of the McGahans of Clonus, and that was Con Curran's mother's people. Quickly post-famine, a part of that family emigrated, and the young boyo Janarius Aloysius McGahan discovered investigative journalism and went back to Europe and reported first on the Commune for American papers. And then, because he was a swift study, he was assigned to the Ottoman Russian front. Eerie to be thinking about that today. And he was the first English language reporter to get the word out to Britain and to other English-speaking groups of the genocide in Bulgaria by the Ottomans, which convinced Disraeli's government to no longer support the Ottomans. So Curran, in his earliest journalistic writing, before he began writing undercover, as many people did, reporting in the liberal British press of the nation about the War of Independence, adopted as his pen name Michael Gahan, with a wink to Janarius Aloysius McGahan. If by chance you get to visit Sofia, Bulgaria, or any such destination points, you might find statues that emblazon J.A. McGahan, liberator of Bulgaria.
I don't think I had heard the story before. I'm going to have to read up on it. There's another famous Irishman who ended up, I think he's got a street named after him in Sofia. He was also a journalist who dabbled in politics. Boucher? Yeah. But I don't think I had heard the story before. It's amazing that there are at least two. We have at least two claims to fame in Sofia. A question for Anne and Margaret and anybody else who wants to chip in, and after this I will throw it open to the audience. Lots of Joyce's former friends, colleagues, fellow students wrote about it in later life. What are the special insights of Con Curran's writings about him? What does he tell us that maybe we don't find out from others? Is there anything that maybe James Joyce would have found out about himself?
Yes, sure. It's very balanced. I think his book is very typical of him. It was written over time and at the instigation sometimes for other publications, and then he grouped these essays together. Memoirs in that period were confessional. That's one thing that's very surprising about them. It's a kind of he gives you an intellectual history of Joyce, a sense of Joyce's evolution, Joyce as a student, their shared cultural values and literary interests. These are two men who did degrees in foreign languages, European languages. That absolutely comes true. Their passion for Italian literature, French literature, Curran a bit more even than Joyce. But he's not just hero worshipping Joyce. He goes back to the initial point, that Joyce is this young man they knew in Dublin, were certainly impressed by, and knew was destined for greatness. But he remained that UCD friend and lifelong friend, so he dissects him. So he's well aware that Joyce suffers from some kind of persecution complex, and that expresses itself in odd ways from time to time. And Con Curran, like everyone else, would have suffered a little from that, having to bail Joyce out or pacify him and so on. So it is a balanced account of Joyce, but it's always Joyce the artist.
Curran notes that when he met him, because there was a 12-year hiatus after Joyce leaves for Europe for good from 1910, is it 1910? And then until 1921, they don't see each other. They're in correspondence, but they don't actually meet each other. And then he meets him in Paris on the Pont des Arts. And he immediately, or fairly immediately, notices he's much more relaxed than he used to be, and there's no sort of terse, tense silences that there used to be. Is that? I can't remember. No, it's in the section where he's talking about meeting in Paris.
Yes.
Is that Joyce having? Because Ulysses is not quite out yet, but obviously it's been released in installments. Yes. Is that because he's relaxed, because he's sort of fulfilled? He has fulfilled his mission, or a lot of it, as opposed to the disgruntled young man who left Ireland, who knew he was talented, but
yeah, it's possible reading about it, but I suppose it's Joyce also. Yeah, Curran is seeing Joyce in Paris on Pont des Arts. It's in such a symbolic location to meet. So it's Joyce the cosmopolitan, and Joyce very much in his milieu in Europe, rather than lying on a bridge in Dublin or in a back garden. So yeah, it's Joyce in a different kind of context, but of course Joyce hasn't got there yet. So Joyce is always sort of in evolution, as Curran writes about him. He's always chasing after these ambitions. So there's a sense of Joyce changing over the years, and friends checking each other,
Curran, I think he actually juxtaposes the two bridges, Pont des Arts and Blackhear Bridge, which I'd never heard of Blackhear Bridge until last year, and I went looking at it's not one of Dublin's more distinguished bridges. It's kind of interesting where it is. But yeah. Margaret.
The only thing I'd add, and particularly conscious of time, I suppose, is just to mention place. One of the things I find so powerful is to see the buildings that we're in this evening, being written about as where their friendship began, that sense of them walking up the steps. I mean, Joyce, 16 and a half, when he came here as a matriculation student. And then to think of our own students today, I'm delighted that Cody, who recently did the MA in Anglo-Irish Literature and worked on Joyce, is here. And I suppose that's what Molly, the place and the book is about, is the next generation of students.
Yeah. Just one other brief question before we turn to the audience. It was the word confession that reminded me of this for some reason. Is it true, am I remembering correctly, that your mother was known to have been reading Ulysses at the age of 9 in her bedroom, or am I misremembering that from the story?
No, you're remembering correctly.
And this would have been in what year? Because
likely the Christmas of 23.
Because it was not actually astonishing enough. They never got around to banning Ulysses in Ireland. So it was freely, well, not freely available, but it was available. And
it was the copy that Joyce sent to her parents. I knew she was a quick study, but that did take me aback.
A lot of bits of the book, I hope she didn't write it. But anyway, I'll throw it open to the floor, please. I'm sure you have questions. Anybody? Dermot Ferreter is a contributor to the project. Is there anything you would like to chip in? Or has Dermot... He's disappeared. Oh no, he's gone. Sorry.
Maybe could I contribute? My name is John. I work in the museum here at the weekends, and I'd like to say that the graduation photo that Colum was more responsible for is one of the more talked about aspects of the museum. And it's not very essentially literary, but we regularly get visitors wanting to know about the other people in the group, and the people in the group went on to have quite a storied part of New Ireland in the following decades. So, I don't know, I'd love to have the opportunity to thank you for being part of and bringing that photo back into emphasis as part of the book. And it's certainly it's a beautiful image.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does we have a question?
It's for Helen and Hugh, actually. And Terence Tilly, if Terence was here. It's about Lee Miller's photographs of locations in Ulysses, which is a remarkable exercise in itself. And I had occasion to research the other photographers who had taken photographs of locations in Ulysses that Joyce just couldn't hear enough of it. He just wanted to get his hands on photographs of the locations in Ulysses. And it's an interesting thing about the 1916 Rising, you know, how much damage or indeed was done to the locations, like the DBC building in O'Connell Street. But those photographs by D. Miller, they are remarkable in their own right, and without even Joyce coming into it. But nonetheless, the fact that they're backlit by Joyce, and Colum Curran walking around Dublin with D. Miller, who had come back from the concentration camps.
That's right.
And patrolled. I mean, it's an uncanny visitation of the nightmare of history in post-World War II Dublin, including the photographs she took, which were not necessarily directly connected to Joyce, but she does take the turf barges, which again is a sidelight, but is very important given the turf in the Phoenix Park and the shortages. So maybe you and Helen could say something about that.
Well, I mean, to me, because Curran's, I think it's the first piece of writing that goes into this appears in the Vogue 1947 with certainly some of them. I think Lee Miller took the photographs for that publication.
Yes.
Or else certainly they appeared there. And I mean, they're beautiful photographs. We could say they're better than Curran's photographs.
The Voices of Joyce volume, the UCD Press, that's where you can find them.
Yeah, but I think, you see, I think Curran, I think there used to be interpretation of some of the Curran photographs that he was taking them at Joyce's behest as a piece of research for Ulysses. They're much later than that. I'm possibly even prompted by walking around with Lee Miller. I would have thought, like, even that late, to feel like, I don't know what you think, Luke, like whether...
Well, there's an interior of Barney Kieran's pub, which is a remarkable piece of archaeology. But a previous guy who Joyce had met in Paris, who was over for a rugby match, he mentioned to Joyce in passing that he had taken photographs of all the locations in Dublin, and it was Mary Colum who called the guy over and said, the guy had recognised Mary Colum. And she said, do you want to meet a really famous writer? All due respect to my husband. And she, like, who? Did you ever hear of James Joyce? She said, we're sure we've all read Joyce. And she rang up Joyce and Mary Colum and said, you won't believe it, there's a guy from Dublin who has taken photographs of the locations in Ulysses. Can he come over? And Joyce couldn't believe it was Christmas for Joyce. And Joyce invited him over. But he did take the photographs, and only 2 or 3 of those have survived, it seems. But clearly, there were Paul Léon had them, and Joyce gave them to Paul Léon. But he just wanted those. He wanted that photographic, and it's very interesting that even though description is at a premium in Ulysses, there's very little visual description, and yet somehow it presupposes that you know. So he presupposes that people have a photographic memory, like himself. But so he won't bother describing the buildings. But so that notion of photography, that Colum Curran was a photographer in his own right, I mean, that's a really important dimension that's filled in by this whole project. So thanks very much for that.
Curran with Joyce was Lee Miller's mentor when she came to Dublin. Curran showed her where to go, the places to visit, like Barney Kieran's, and he was her guide throughout. Folk must have contacted him to get him to do this, you know, but he did it with
Are they the only, is that the only photograph of the inside Barney Kieran's? I've never seen another one. That was it.
Very important.
Extraordinary.
Beginning to sound like a closing note.
Anybody else want to, what time is it? It's coming up to 8. So if you want to ask some more questions here, or you can ask them afterwards if you want. Anybody else want to, while you have the panel pinned down here?
Or remarks, because there are people in this room who
please, sorry, when I say questions, please feel free to make contributions. Nobody, you're all too shy.
Can I say thank you to Helen for this enterprise and for bringing us all together, and for kind of continuing the work of her grandparents in kind of adding to the collection and building on the collection into the future. I think that's really important. Thank you.
Here's it. And I think on that suitable note, we will wrap up. And I presume everybody's waiting around for a few minutes. So if you want to follow it up with them in person, you can do so.
Frank,
anyway, thanks.
Frank, could I maybe just ask if Noel would explain the special edition, just in case people don't fully understand the significance of that? If Noel is there, yeah.
Hello everyone. Book is for sale at the back. If you consider buying a copy, there's the standard edition, which isn't a good description. It's an absolutely stunning book in the standard edition, which is all the beautiful details and design features as the special edition. But the extra benefit with the special edition is it's gold embossed, so you'll see the difference when you see it. But it also comes with this beautiful architectural print, designed and drawn personally by Jennifer and Jonathan at the front here, with obviously support and direction and advice from Hugh and the UCD School of Architecture. It's just absolutely stunning. There's an example of it laid out at the back of the room, even just to enjoy just their amazing talent. Please go and have a look at it. Obviously, we'd love if anybody would like to buy a copy and put it on their shelves and put it on their wall and enjoy it. But please just appreciate it, because the work that went into it is just extraordinary. And it's just that extra layer on top of the amazing work done by this team. And we're delighted to have been part of it. Thank you very much.